Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Today we're going to be taking a look at part 2 of Extra History's look at the Zulu Empire. This one's called The Wrath of Shaka Zulu. Just a little bit more background into what's happening at this time and place in African history. We'll take a look at in just a second. If you didn't see part 1 of my reaction, the link is in the description, as is the link to the original content for this video if you want to watch it without my commentary. The Zulu at this time are one of the smallest of about 800 clans in a group of people known as the Eastern Nguni and Bantu clans. They're also known as the Western Bantu people, and the only reason I know anything about the Western Bantu people is because my DNA says that I descend from them. I'm about 5% Western Bantu peoples, but that's further up in Africa. So it says that the Zulu numbered somewhere around 1,500, and that put them as one of the smallest of 800 different clans. And yet the Zulu, of all the tribes among the Bantu people, those are the ones that we know about from history, and it's because of this man Shaka. So let's dive into a little more of his story today.
Last we left off, Shaka's boss, Dingiswayo, had just been killed at the hands of a man named Zwide. Shaka had declared vengeance against Zwide and his clan, the Ndwandwe, and the Zulu had moved from being a tribe to a fledgling empire, as Shaka consolidated control over the Matetwa, Dingiswayo's powerful clan. Today we look into the war between Shaka and Zwide, and the disaster that followed in its wake. As Shaka took control of the Matetwa tribe, he began to spread his ideas amongst them, teaching them how to fight in Zulu fashion, and having them take on the Zulu name. He instilled in this newly consolidated Zulu clan a warrior culture that had never existed before, and changed them from being pastoral herdsmen to conquerors.
And several of you actually made the point yesterday that this is actually a thing that happens often in history when we look at some of the great conquests of history, great leaders. These leaders very often bring with them something completely new, something completely different, or at least different to the people that are being exposed to it. And because the armies they're facing don't know how to deal with that, they get overcome, oftentimes by a weaker or a smaller force, and that happens here. Shaka trains them in a completely new way of fighting. He trains them in real warfare rather than just kind of the warfare for sport, as it were. That's just kind of a, it's not a real accurate way to describe it, but it's a good way to get it in your mind what warfare was like. He turns them into killers. He turns them into a conquering tribe, and they're able to overcome long odds because of that. Napoleon did something similar with how he organized his army into corps, which it wasn't a brand new concept, but it was new for that time and place. And it worked because he was able to do things other armies weren't doing. So same thing happens here.
With this, Shaka began his frequently brutal expansion outward, bringing in neighboring tribes with diplomacy when possible, but often resorting to the extremities of force. Unlike the ritual warfare of old, when his forces would engage an enemy band, their goal was to destroy the enemy completely. And when the forces under arms were destroyed, he would march into the enemy village, often killing all the men of fighting age, assimilating only the women and children into the Zulu tribe. Finally, after training his people and expanding his reach, Shaka felt ready to take on Zwide. As Zwide's Ndwandwe forces pushed their way into what was now Zulu territory, Shaka ran a number of delaying tactics along the Umfolozi River, while he moved his people and his cattle out of harm's way.
Cattle, remember, that's wealth, that is prestige, that is power. Cattle you've got to hold on to. It's a big symbol. It's almost like currency in some ways.
Then he arrayed his forces, about 5,000 strong, on a hill, right in the path of the oncoming Ndwandwe army. To the Ndwandwe, this looked like an easy victory. They had more than twice as many men as Shaka could muster, and never before had one of the Zulu armies really been able to stand against them. Shaka, seeing his disadvantage in numbers, split a small contingent from his force, and used it to lure off a sizable portion of the enemy's army. But the Ndwandwe coming toward the hill still outnumbered him. This actually turned into an advantage for Shaka, though. The Ndwandwe forces got in each other's way as they tried to clamber up the hill in a disorganized mob. This disorder, combined with the uphill ascent, made the long throwing spears the Ndwandwe carried useless.
It's over. We have the high ground. And remember, again, throwing spears are a one-time event, right? Once you throw them, now what do? Shaka's men are trained in close combat with smaller weapons, and so you avoid that first hit from the melee or from the missile weapons. Now you've got the advantage, even if you don't have the numbers.
The Zulu countercharged, rushing downhill and crashing into the enemy line with their short stabbing spears. The enemy routed, stampeding back down the hill. Shaka gathered his men back into formation at the top of the hill and waited. 5 times that day, the Ndwandwe charged the hill, and 5 times they were repulsed by the smaller force. As the day wore on, the Ndwandwe began to suffer from that great bane of armies in tropical climes, the heat. Ndwandwe men started to slip off to the river about a mile away. Meanwhile, every time the Ndwandwe fell back, the Zulu warriors refreshed themselves with supplies Shaka had hidden atop the hill. The day was going well for Shaka, but even with...
So he thought ahead. He's planned for everything, and this is another mark of a brilliant military mind, is you're thinking 3-4 steps ahead. Okay, so he's not just thinking about the here and now. He's thinking about, what do we do if we get surrounded? What if we're up here for a while? What if the enemy doesn't charge up the hill? What if they just surround us and try to wait us out? So he's got supplies. He's ready. He's willing to wait this out, and he's thought ahead of what he needs to do.
With his successes, his force was still outnumbered. Then, Shaka saw a signal fire in the distance. The diversionary force he had used to lure away a column of the Ndwandwe were letting him know that the contingent chasing them were on their way back. Shaka didn't have much time. He needed to shatter the Ndwandwe before the rest of their forces returned.
So again, planned ahead, had a signal so he knew, so they could communicate. Sometimes communication's a key factor, especially in the days before radios and things like that. If you can find out what's coming, imagine if Napoleon had this level of communication to know that the Prussians were on their way at Waterloo, for example, because he didn't really know until the last minute.
But even though Zwide's men had been beaten back time and again, they had taken a toll on the Zulus' numbers. Seeing this, Zwide marshaled his troops and prepared to lead them personally in one last grand assault. But Shaka was ready for him. All day, this entire time, he had only been fighting with 2/3 of his men, the chest and horns of his bull's horn strategy.
Got the loins.
The other third, the loins, had been hidden in a depression behind the hill, rested and fresh. Now he called on them to join the horns and envelop the enemy. See?
The enemy's been fighting all day. They're exhausted. They've been coming up the hill over and over again, and they think they've got you where they want you, and now you unleash the fresh troops on them. And this is a strategy that the Romans used, where they would hold back reserves, and they would kind of, work out their men so that they kept them fresh and kept them ready to fight.
Seeing this large force appear as if from nowhere, the Ndwandwe began to panic. Pinned by the chest and encircled by the horns, this last column of Ndwandwe was crushed, with its tattered remnants fleeing down the hill. Shaka sent a small contingent of men to kill any Ndwandwe they could find taking water at the river, while his main force pursued the bulk of the fleeing army. But as the Ndwandwe column that had followed his diversionary force began to close in, Shaka was forced to give up the chase. The day was a bloody one. As was common in this new style of war, neither side took prisoners. As the sun set, nearly 2,000 Zulus lay dead, as did 7,500 Ndwandwe troops. But their leader, Zwide, was not among them. Zwide was not well liked among the nearby tribes, and as cracks in the mighty Ndwandwe army began to show, Shaka was able to gain new allies and new client states for his confederacy.
So I want to take a minute and stop and take a look at some of the numbers from that battle and see what else we might know about it. So the Ndwandwe Zulu War was between 1817 and 1819. It tells us here that though I don't know what the sources are for this and how accurate they are, but it tells us that Shaka had about 4,000 men total. So if that's the case, he lost better than half of his army in that battle. He's facing altogether 25,000 men. This is probably the battle here. The Battle of the Mulatase River in 1820, following the Zulu Civil War. And we really just don't know. Or is this the battle here? The Battle of, I don't even know how to pronounce that. So here we go. Yeah, this is the battle here. 5,000 for Shaka against 12,000. For the Ndwandwe, they lost 7,500, so about 3-to-1 casualties, a little better than 3-to-1. They lost better than 50%. So pretty significant casualties on both sides.
Bolstering his numbers. After 18 more months of minor skirmishes, the final battle between the two forces came at the Mahlatuzi River. As the Ndwandwe forces were trying to cross, the Zulu engaged, trapping half their forces on each side. Over the course of 2 days of running battle, the Ndwandwe forces were scattered. Seeing his opportunity, Shaka took his forces and marched on the Ndwandwe capital before word of their army's defeat could reach them. As he approached, before his men were close enough to be seen clearly from the capital, he had them start to sing Ndwandwe victory songs. Upon hearing the singing, the populace rushed out to greet them, only to be slaughtered by the oncoming forces.
Wow.
Zwide managed to escape, but his mother did not. Shaka locked her in a house with jackals and hyenas to eat her alive, and when the night was done...
Man, that's some, like, Game of Thrones stuff right there. He's got them singing their victory songs to lure the people out just to slaughter them. And then he pulls like a Ramsay Bolton and feeds the mother to jackals. Wow, that is brutal stuff.
He had the house burnt to the ground so only ash would remain. Over the coming years, Shaka continued to expand his reach and assert Zulu dominance over all the tribes in the area. He turned his confederacy into a true empire and exerted influence far beyond even the regions he could control. But all those tribes he had pushed out, all the fleeing refugees he had left behind, all the warriors he had driven from their homes, spread out like a fire across the savannah. All those men who had seen the Zulu fight adopted the Zulu way of war, and...
That's always the risk you eventually run, is that people learn how you fight. They model that for themselves. And if it's more about the tactics than it is about the leader, okay, so if what we're saying here is that Shaka trained them on a tactic that works, but he's not necessarily someone who's going to change tactics constantly to suit the situation, then once your enemies learn the tactic, then you've lost your advantage. So it'll be interesting to see if he's able to overcome this by switching things up a little bit.
And as they fled the now mighty Zulu, they inflicted the same brutality on those around them. This was the Mfecane, the crushing. These tribes that fled the Zulu either died out or formed kingdoms of their own with the same bloody tactics they had learned from the Zulu, and at an incredible price. Over the next 15 years, well over 1 million people would die as these refugees from the Zulu cut their way across the southern half of Africa. But by 1827, not all was right in the Zulu kingdom. Shaka's mother, the parent who had raised him, died, and...
I want to touch base on something a little bit here. There was some talk yesterday, too, about what constitutes an empire, what's a kingdom, and you can hear that they're kind of using them interchangeably here. They just called it a kingdom there. The title says empire. Typically, when we think of an empire, we think of multiple kingdoms under an emperor that are, together. For example, Napoleon is an emperor because he's got multiple kingdoms like France and Spain and Italy and Saxony and things like that. The British Empire with the king, with various realms underneath it, things like that. Honestly, it's probably just semantics. Empire is often used to refer to things that probably technically aren't empires. We talk about financial empires. We talk about wealth empires. We talk about empires of land and things like that, and an oil empire, So it's just one of those terms that sometimes we use.
And he went mad with grief. Sources report him ordering that no grain be planted for a year, that any woman who got pregnant was to be executed along with her husband, that milk was not to be gathered from their cattle. It said that he had 7,000 people killed for not grieving enough.
This is a great way to lose your kingdom, right? I mean, start doing crazy stuff like this. My mom died, so now I'm going to make everybody suffer. And if you don't grieve enough, you're done. That's a great way to get somebody to want to assassinate you, somebody who's close to you. Foreshadowing a little bit.
That he had cows slaughtered so that their calves would know what it was like to lose a mother. It goes without saying that shortly after this, he was assassinated by his brothers. They'd been trying to get rid of him for some time anyway. But as so often happens with these things, his 2 brothers shortly became 1 brother, as there's just not enough room for 2 on the throne. And so, with 2 brothers bumped off in short succession, a man named Dingane became the leader of the Zulu Empire. After either bribing or killing anybody still loyal to Shaka, Dingane faced a new threat. Dutch settlers, pushed east by the British colonial efforts in South Africa.
And it's important to note that these colonial efforts had already been going on before the Zulu, but eventually you're going to start to have them bump heads.
Began to enter Zulu land. At first, relations appeared cordial, with the Dutch helping to recover some 7,000 cattle from Dingane's enemies in return for land in the Zulu territory. But when the Dutch came to Dingane's capital to sign the agreement, in the midst of a ceremonial dance, Dingane shouted to have them seized and dragged off to a nearby hill, where they were all clubbed to death. Dingane then sent troops off to massacre the now undefended Dutch wagon train. As is so often the case, none of this ends well for anybody.
Don't tick off the angry white guy with the artillery. Just saying.
Dutch sent out another wagon train, but this one full of nothing but fighters. In what's now known as the Battle of Bloody River, over 10,000 Zulus attacked the circled wagons of the Dutch, but with only their short spears to fight with and on poor terrain, funneled into a killing plain. 3,000 Zulus lay dead by the end of the day, and only 3 of the Dutch were even wounded. This battle broke the back of Dingane's forces. The last remaining half-brother of Dingane, who had fled with thousands of his followers after seeing how Dingane treated the rest of his relatives, now came storming back, and the Dutch immediately became his allies. In the end, he crushed Dingane, and he himself took over the leadership of the Zulu. He established a wary peace with the Dutch settlers, granting them land in return for their aid, and began his reign in relative tranquility.
So, he did what his brother was not willing to do, which was to make friends with the more powerful enemy and try to live in harmony side by side. Try to have an uneasy truce, everybody's happy, everybody gets to live, but that'll only last for so long.
Next week, we'll find out just how that peace turned out, and follow the lengthy reign of the new Zulu king, Mpande.
All right, let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Check out the link to the original content creator if you would. And we'll see you tomorrow with part 3. Thanks for watching.